Rome 2 is the 8th installment in the Total War series. Developed by the Creative Assembly, it was released in September of 2013 and has since been the subject of much community backlash. Despite it breaking all previous Total War sales figures, it was launched in a largely buggy state and lacked the polish that should be expected of AAA titles. That said, over the last 8 months since its launch, the game has been actively patched, and with that in mind, I'm going to take a look at Rome 2, as it is, upon the release of patch 12. Before the game's official release, it was touted that Rome 2 would have a budget 40% in excess of the previous Total War game, Shogun 2. It appears, however, that the majority of this budget went into flashy marketing campaigns and improvements to graphical fidelity. While Rome 2 is objectively a very impressive looking title, that's never been where the franchise's strength lies. While seeing 5,000 Romans decimate their Celtic opponents is a sight to behold, much of the magic is lost when the opposing AI decides it's more prudent to perform a ritualistic dance than defend its homeland. And this leads on to one of the biggest bugbears of Rome 2 as it was on release. The majority of the game's content comes from the opposition the AI presents. There are occasional glorious moments where two armies clash, however these are always few and far between. More often than not, you are forced to contend with the apparent stupidity of the computer, rather than the might of the opposing force. Entire armies could stand idle while you circumvent them in order to capture a battlefield flag. This contrived mechanic allowed for impossible fights to become simple victories. The poor design of this game's AI, however, is not limited to open battles. It in fact became far more apparent when you engaged in siege battles. Medieval 2 makes for an interesting point of comparison. A siege battle within Medieval 2 usually involved the besieger destroying several sections of wall and sending forces through each of these in an attempt to overwhelm the defender. Despite its crude execution, it proved challenging enough. Rome 2, however, appeared to have regressed, and siege battles became very rigid. Ladders would be sent in a futile effort to gain control of a gate. Once this fails, the AI would send individual units against all odds to burn and eventually destroy a gate. This in itself is not an unfeasible strategy. It's the third and final action taken that causes confusion. Every part of the AI army is sent through the gate with no regards given to the unit's rank or ability, generals included. I'd like to say this was the worst part of the game's battle AI, but this was always far more preferable to the alternative, that being nothing. Entire armies standing idle for the duration of a battle was not an uncommon sight, and more often than I'd like to admit, it was possible to use this bug to win against impossible odds. Battles aside, much of the game is spent viewing the strategic world map and contending with the campaign AI. Maybe some of the glaring issues with Rome 2 could have been somewhat justified if the campaign component had provided much of the depth and challenge that's otherwise not present in these battles. This, however, proved not to be the case. The campaign AI was plagued with issues from the outset. It proved overly passive and predictable, only offering challenge to the newest of Total War gamers. Endless wars could be declared, and yet the only time that it was possible to draw an opponent out from their castles was to leave vast areas of your own land undefended, at which point your towns would be immediately attacked. This leads to the majority of fights being siege battles, and while this may be considered historically accurate, it makes for gameplay that leaves a lot to be desired. This, combined with the horrendous siege AI, made for an overall negative experience. However, Rome 2 was not without promise. 8 months and 12 patches later, Rome 2 has received regular updates to both fix bugs and add game content. Alongside this, paid DLC has also been periodically released, providing new campaigns, factions, and units. These additions, however, don't address the fundamentally flawed core game mechanics. While minor improvements have been made and most game-breaking bugs resolved, Rome 2 does still not live up to expectations. AI within siege battles no longer finds itself standing idle outside of city walls. It can launch a competent attack, but a myriad of issues can see this quickly grind to a halt. For example, if a unit is killed while using the battering ram, that gate becomes blocked. Any torches thrown in an effort to burn the gate instead collide with the ram. Fortunately for this to happen, the AI has to actually build and utilize siege equipment. Multiple patches have claimed to have implemented fixes to this end. However, I've still yet to see the computer build any sort of tower or ram in a grand campaign. In a half-assed attempt to resolve many of the problems of siege battles, the besieger is granted a number of ladders during the city assault. The start of every fight sees these ladders being pushed to the wall, climbed by a single unit, then promptly abandoned. Siege equipment reuse is still an outstanding problem, and while the patch notes would claim to have addressed the issue, the truth is far from the reality. I find every one of these battles boils down to the same thing: ladders are pushed to walls, gates burnt, and finally an all-out not-so-glorious charge by the besieger is undertaken. 5,000 units piling up and attempting to break through a single gate does not feel particularly strategic or challenging. A few well-placed pikemen in a phalanx can more often than not hold a gate indefinitely. 12 patches have made little difference here. Fortunately, there has been far more significant improvements to the AI within open field battles. There has been a welcome improvement to both the AI's decision making and strategic planning. Cavalry flanking maneuvers, ranged unit skirmishing, and good target prioritization are all a common sight. In addition to this, in a move largely based upon players' feedback, all capture points have been removed from open field battles. It would have been nice to see these strategic improvements being applied as higher difficulty settings are chosen, rather than the current system which adjusts the opposing unit's morale to give the computer an artificial advantage. The campaign gameplay has also seen improvements, largely due to the AI's enhancement. All AI factions are now more aggressive, forge bigger alliances, and better manage their own economy. This does lead to a tangible increase in the game's overall challenge. The aforementioned free content updates have added seasons and improved unit recruitment mechanics, and this has gone some way towards bettering the overall experience. Still, little has been done to break the game's monotony the further you progress into a campaign. Once you've built a sizable army and used it to capture a town, that army must remain in order to ensure the continued happiness of the population, until its culture and conquest negative multiplier have been reduced. While this in itself is not a bad mechanic, its execution results in the game's stagnation. Armies must occupy settlements, slowing the game's pace. When a town is captured, 10 or more turns may be spent creating the necessary buildings in order to allow it to function without a military presence. While Rome 2 has seen significant advances in both its real-time and turn-based gameplay, I'd still be hard-pressed to recommend this game. AI is still the largest concern. It has most definitely been improved upon since release, however it's still nothing to write home about. Its actions are often predictable, unfeasible, or downright stupid. Siege battles are repetitive, and despite additional town environments being patched in, they offer very little challenge to the player. I feel the game's real strength comes from its open field battles. These massive spectacles are impressive and can often be fairly difficult. However, these types of battles are few and far between. The rest of the game's content does not carry itself well. It's a visually impressive, thematically outstanding game, but that's all it appears to be. Beyond the initial challenge of gaining a foothold in the new campaign, little is offered to keep the experience fresh and engaging, which is a crying shame. Many times I found myself restarting a campaign, simply to experience this challenge again. The early game diplomacy shapes much of what's to happen in the 20 to 30 turns to follow. Breaking treaties and turning allies against one another serves to provide endless hours of entertainment. While the last 12 patches have really improved the early game, fixed game-breaking bugs, and opened up options for players, the improvements really have not taken into consideration the mid and late game. For example, the province system is still as basic as ever. In their efforts to streamline building management, they've instead simplified it, removing much of what made the previous Total War titles engaging throughout the whole experience. Every province is limited to one walled town, and a small number of villages. Each of these have a very limited amount of build space, and use a growth mechanic that governs the rate at which you can create these new buildings. While the limited space itself is not a problem, the inability to alter these towns results in very repetitive and shallow gameplay. Every time I play the Roman faction, I know exactly what I'm going to build, and in which town I'm going to build it to best optimise the space I have. And because these settlements can never be changed, they will always have the same amount of building space regardless of how the game plays out. Total War games have always been about creating your own history, forging an empire, and while Rome 2 does offer this experience, it feels watered down. Every empire I build feels very much like the last. Complaints aside, I find the Creative Assembly's efforts to support their game admirable. I don't, however, agree with the state in which the game was launched, and even after 8 months of constant patching, the game does not feel very fleshed out. There are still numerous problems, and while Rome 2 could be very much enjoyed, I don't see a whole lot of replayability beyond the initial learning curve, and thus recommending it at a full price is a hard sell. Particularly because of the large amounts of DLC currently available, which do little to improve the experience. However, if you've got an interest in grand strategy games, battles on an epic scale, or simply want to rewrite history, I'd recommend picking up Rome 2 during one of its regular sales, and I would not get this a second thought at the lower price point. Many of the more interesting factions, such as the Greek states, require the purchase of DLC. Unless you want a specific faction, I'd suggest avoiding these packs. Blood and Gore, on the other hand, is a relatively cheap and fun addition to the game, and for £2 it's hard to go wrong. There is also an extremely active modding scene for this game. These mods range from small visual changes to entire overhauls, so if the basic gameplay is not to your tastes, you should check out the Steam Workshop and see what's available.